Imagine carrying a weight so familiar you've forgotten it's there. A feeling buried so deep inside you that it has become part of your personality, your silence, your skin. What if the most powerful force shaping your relationships, your decisions, and your destiny isn't something you've ever said out loud? What if it lives entirely in the space between your thoughts and your words? Think about the last time someone asked you how you were doing. You said, fine. But fine wasn't the truth, was it? Something heavier was sitting just beneath that single syllable. You chose silence. Not because you're weak, not because you didn't want to speak, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that certain feelings were safer left unspoken. And here's what no one tells you about that choice. It doesn't make the feeling disappear. It makes it louder. It makes it architectural. It begins to build the house you live in emotionally. Every unspoken feeling becomes a brick. And slowly, quietly, without your conscious permission, you construct an entire interior world that nobody else is allowed to enter. This is not a video about communication tips or emotional intelligence hacks. This is something far more unsettling and far more important than that. This is an excavation, a descent into the hidden psychology of everything you've never said and what those unspoken feelings are doing to you right now in real time. We live in an era obsessed with expression. Social media demands constant disclosure. Therapy culture celebrates vulnerability. And yet, despite all of this noise, despite all of these platforms and confessional spaces, human beings are lonelier, more emotionally suppressed, and more psychologically fractured than at any point in recorded history. There is a paradox at the center of modern emotional life. We have more ways to communicate than ever before, and yet we communicate less of what actually matters than any generation before us. We perform emotion constantly. We share aestheticized grief, curated joy, and polished authenticity. But the raw, unfiltered, trembling truth of what we actually feel? That stays locked behind the eyes, behind the smile, behind the carefully composed caption. This gap, between what is felt and what is expressed, is not just a personal issue. It is a civilizational wound. It is quietly destroying relationships, corroding mental health, and producing generations of people who are fluent in performance but illiterate in genuine feeling. Psychologists have a term for the emotional content that exists beneath conscious expression. They call it the affective residue, the emotional sediment that accumulates when feelings are experienced but never processed or communicated. But this concept doesn't fully capture the power and the danger of what we're discussing today. Because what we are exploring goes beyond residue. It becomes identity. It becomes destiny. The phenomenon we are entering today can be called emotional submersion, the deeply human, deeply costly practice of living below the surface of your own emotional truth. It is not repression in the clinical sense. It is something more sophisticated, more socially engineered, and more universally practiced. It is the conscious and unconscious decision to keep your deepest feelings permanently submerged, not out of pathology but out of profound, learned psychological survival. By the end of this video, you will understand why you go quiet when you should speak. You will understand the hidden cost of every feeling you've swallowed. You will see the invisible architecture of your emotional life clearly, perhaps for the first time. More importantly, you will understand that this is not a flaw in your character. It is a response to a world that was never truly safe enough for your honesty. But understanding that is only the beginning. Because once you see it, once you truly see it, you cannot unsee it. And that awareness carries its own kind of power. If this kind of deep psychological excavation resonates with you, if you've ever felt more understood by a stranger's words than by the people closest to you, then this channel exists for you. Consider subscribing not as a passive gesture, but as a conscious choice to keep exploring the parts of yourself most people never dare examine. Here is the uncomfortable truth that this video is built upon. You are not afraid of other people's reactions. You are afraid of your own feelings becoming real the moment you speak them out loud. There is a psychological phenomenon so quietly devastating that most people live their entire lives inside it without ever naming it. The act of speaking a feeling transforms it from something abstract and manageable into something concrete and undeniable. As long as the feeling remains unspoken, you retain a kind of psychological deniability. You can tell yourself it isn't that serious. You can negotiate with it. You can keep it at a distance that feels safe. But the moment you say, "I am lonely," or "I am angry," or "I am terrified of being abandoned," the moment those words leave your mouth, the feeling becomes architecture. It becomes real. And real things demand real responses. So silence becomes a coping mechanism of extraordinary sophistication. It is not weakness. It is a deeply intelligent, if ultimately self-destructive, strategy for emotional self-preservation. Carl Jung understood this more than a century ago. He wrote that what you resist persists, but he also understood something more nuanced, that human beings don't just resist pain. They resist the transformation that comes from fully acknowledging pain. Because acknowledgement is not just awareness. Acknowledgement is the first step toward change. And change, even when desperately needed, is one of the most psychologically threatening experiences a human being can face. Now consider how the systems around you have weaponized this tendency. Consider how the structures of modern life, education, media, corporate culture, even family dynamics, have been engineered, intentionally or not, to keep your feelings perpetually unspoken. From the earliest age, most human beings receive a consistent, powerful, and deeply damaging message. Emotional expression is a social liability. Crying is weakness. Anger is dangerous. Vulnerability is an invitation to exploitation. Schools reward intellectual performance and punish emotional disruption. Workplaces demand professional composure as a condition of belonging. Social media platforms algorithmically amplify outrage and performance while suppressing the quiet, messy, unresolvable complexity of genuine human feeling. Even therapy, the one space explicitly designed for emotional expression, has been commodified and aestheticized to the point where many people perform healing rather than actually experiencing it. The system does not want your authentic emotional life. It wants your productivity, your compliance, and your consumption. And the most effective way to ensure all three is to convince you that your deepest feelings are either shameful, irrelevant, or too dangerous to express. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more insidious than a conspiracy. It is a cultural operating system, installed so early and so consistently that most people mistake it for their own psychology. Michel Foucault argued that power operates most effectively not through overt force, but through the internalization of norms. When you silence your own feelings before anyone else can silence them for you, power has achieved its most elegant form of control. You become your own censor. You become the gatekeeper of your own emotional truth. And you do it with such fluency that it feels like self-awareness rather than suppression. Now let us go deeper into the psychological mechanics of what actually happens inside the mind and body when feelings are chronically unspoken. The human nervous system does not distinguish between an emotional experience and a physical one. When a feeling arises and is suppressed before expression, the body does not file it away neatly. The body holds it. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the most important trauma researchers of the modern era, spent decades documenting what he called the somatic signature of unexpressed emotion. The body keeps the score, he wrote, and that phrase has resonated with millions because it names something people feel but cannot articulate. Your chronic tension lives in your shoulders. Your unexpressed grief lives in your chest. Your swallowed anger lives in your jaw, your gut, your lower back. These are not metaphors. They are physiological realities, documented through neuroscience and clinical observation. But it goes beyond the physical. Chronically unspoken feelings don't just accumulate in the body. They begin to distort cognition. They warp perception. They create what psychologists call emotional reasoning, the cognitive pattern where feelings become facts. When you have never spoken your fear of abandonment, that fear begins to interpret every ambiguous social signal as confirmation of its narrative. A delayed text message becomes proof of rejection. A moment of silence in conversation becomes evidence of your own unworthiness. The unspoken feeling doesn't stay silent. It becomes the interpreter of your reality. It puts on the costume of rational thought and begins to make decisions on your behalf. Choices you believe are logical but are actually driven entirely by the emotional sediment you've never allowed to surface. This is why introspection without expression is so dangerous. You can spend years examining yourself, years in meditation, years journaling, and still remain fundamentally trapped if the process never moves from internal observation to genuine outward expression. Ask yourself this honestly. How many of your current relationships are being quietly shaped by feelings you have never directly expressed? How many distances between you and people you love were built not by conflict, but by the accumulated weight of things left unsaid? How many versions of yourself have you presented to the world that bore only a surface resemblance to who you actually are? And how exhausting has it been to maintain that presentation across years, across relationships, across the entire architecture of your daily life. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being consistently unseen. And the deepest tragedy is this: in most cases, the person responsible for keeping you unseen is you yourself. Not because you are self-destructive, but because you were never given a world safe enough to be fully visible in. You adapted. You survived. And that survival strategy, once necessary, has now become the cage. Now let us examine the cultural architecture that has normalized emotional invisibility so completely that most people no longer recognize it as a choice at all. We live in a civilization that celebrates stoicism in men and compliance in women. Two different masks, two different performances, but the same fundamental instruction: do not let your true emotional experience disrupt the surface of things. Boys are taught, with extraordinary consistency and cruelty, that emotional expression is a form of social suicide. The message arrives through ridicule, through silence, through the withdrawn approval of fathers and peers who themselves never learned another way. Girls are taught something equally damaging but more subtle. They are permitted to feel, but only within socially sanctioned emotional registers. Sadness is acceptable. Softness is acceptable. But anger, ambition, and the full force of unfiltered truth, those are still policed with remarkable precision. And so an entire civilization of adults walks around carrying emotional worlds of extraordinary complexity and depth, performing simplified versions of themselves for a society that rewards legibility over authenticity. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. But before you can offer genuine attention to another human being, you must first be willing to offer it to yourself, to your own feelings, to your own truth. Most people have never done this. Not truly. They have analyzed themselves. They have categorized their trauma and labeled their attachment styles. But analysis is not attention. Analysis keeps feeling at arm's length. Genuine attention requires proximity. It requires stillness. It requires the willingness to sit with what is actually there without immediately trying to fix, explain, or escape it. Here is a question that deserves more than a passing thought. When was the last time you sat with a difficult feeling long enough to truly understand what it was trying to tell you? Not to process it quickly and move on. Not to reframe it into something more manageable. But to actually listen to it the way you would listen to someone you deeply loved? Because feelings are not problems to be solved. They are messengers. They carry information about your needs, your values, your boundaries, and your deepest sense of what matters. When you silence them before they can speak, you don't just suppress discomfort. You cut off access to the most essential intelligence your inner life possesses. This is the cultural critique that never gets made loudly enough. Productivity culture has convinced an entire generation that efficiency is a virtue applicable to all domains of human experience, including emotion. We are taught to process grief quickly and return to function. We are praised for bouncing back, for resilience understood as the speed of recovery rather than the depth of integration. We celebrate people who seem unaffected by difficulty as though emotional imperviousness were a sign of strength rather than a warning sign of profound disconnection. The result is a culture of what sociologist Arlie Hochschild called emotional labor, expanded to its most exhausting possible scale. We are all constantly managing, curating, and performing our emotional states for the consumption of others. And in doing so, we have lost access to the raw, unmanaged, unperformed truth of what we actually feel. But it goes deeper than cultural conditioning. It goes deeper than systemic pressure. Because at the very center of this phenomenon is something far more intimate and far more psychologically complex. At the center of emotional submersion is a belief. Not a conscious belief, not one you could easily articulate if asked, but a belief that operates with the quiet authority of a foundational axiom. It is this, that if the people in your life truly knew what you felt, truly knew the full weight and complexity and sometimes darkness of your inner world, they would leave. This is the belief that lives beneath most human silence. Not the fear of judgment in the abstract. The specific, personal, devastating fear that your authentic emotional self is fundamentally too much or not enough for the people you most need to keep close. Psychologists call this the core shame wound. And it is so widespread, so universally distributed across cultures, genders, and generations, that it might be more accurate to call it a feature of the human condition rather than a pathology. John Bradshaw, whose work on shame transformed how we understand family systems and emotional development, argued that toxic shame is not the feeling that you have done something wrong. It is the belief that you fundamentally are something wrong, that your existence in its unfiltered state is a problem. When that belief is operating beneath the surface of your psychology, silence becomes not just a coping strategy but a form of self-protection so deeply embedded that it feels like identity. You don't experience it as suppression. You experience it as discretion, as maturity, as the wisdom of knowing which feelings are appropriate to share and which should be kept private. And some of that is genuinely true. Not every feeling needs to be expressed to every person in every context. Emotional intelligence does include discernment. But there is a profound difference between choosing silence from a position of security and choosing silence from a position of fear. Most people, if they are honest, are choosing the latter far more often than the former. They are not being discreet. They are hiding. And they have been hiding for so long that the hiding feels like their natural state. Consider the relationships in your life most defined by unspoken things. The friendship where something shifted years ago and neither of you has ever directly addressed it. The family dynamic where everyone knows the truth but operates around it as though it were a piece of furniture in the center of the room. The romantic relationship where you have rehearsed a conversation in your mind dozens of times, scripted every word, anticipated every response, and then, when the moment comes, said something entirely different. Something safer. Something that left the real feeling untouched and the real distance intact. What is the cumulative cost of those moments? What does it cost a relationship year after year to be navigated around its own most important conversations? What does it cost a person to carry the rehearsed version of their truth indefinitely, never delivering it, never releasing it? The cost is not dramatic. That is what makes it so insidious. It doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like tiredness. It feels like a vague, persistent sense that something is slightly wrong, slightly off, slightly less than it should be, in your relationships, in your sense of self, in your experience of daily life. That low-grade emotional static is the sound of a life being lived one level below its own depth. It is the sound of a person who is present but not fully arrived, connected but not truly known, alive but not entirely awake to their own existence. There is a war happening inside most human beings, and it is being fought in almost complete silence. It is the war between what you know and what you feel, between the truth your logic constructs and the truth your body already knows. You know, intellectually, that expressing your feelings would likely deepen your relationships. You know that vulnerability, as Brené Brown's decades of research have demonstrated, is not weakness but the precise mechanism through which genuine human connection is forged. You know that the silence is costing you. You can feel the cost in the heaviness that settles into your chest during certain conversations, in the way you replay interactions for hours afterward, mentally inserting the words you should have said. And yet you stay silent, again and again and again. Not because you lack the knowledge, but because knowledge and emotional readiness are profoundly different things. You cannot think your way into vulnerability. You cannot intellectualize yourself into openness. This is the internal conflict that sits at the very heart of emotional submersion. The conscious mind understands what is needed. The nervous system, conditioned by years of learned emotional danger, refuses to cooperate. Neuroscience has given us the language to understand why. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought and long-term decision-making, knows that honesty serves your deepest interests. But when emotional threat is perceived, the amygdala, ancient, fast, and entirely unimpressed by your intellectual arguments, overrides that knowledge with a speed and authority that leaves reason standing helplessly at the door. This is not a character flaw. This is biology in conversation with biography. Your nervous system learned its lessons from real experiences of real emotional danger. And it is trying, with everything it has, to protect you from a repetition of those experiences. The tragedy is that in protecting you from the past, it is preventing you from accessing the present. The emotional walls built to survive previous relationships are now the barriers preventing you from fully inhabiting your current ones. Now consider the consequences that accumulate over a lifetime of this pattern. Not the dramatic consequences, not the sudden collapses, but the slow, quiet erosion that occurs when a person never fully arrives in their own emotional life. Relationships that could have been profound remain pleasant but shallow. Potential intimacies are approached but never quite reached, like a person who stands at the edge of the ocean every day but never enters the water. Years pass, decades pass, and at some point, often in midlife, often in the quiet aftermath of a loss or a failure or an unexpected moment of clarity, a question arises with uncomfortable force. Is this all there is? Is this the depth of connection I am capable of? Is this the version of myself I intended to become? That question is not a crisis. It is an invitation. It is the unspoken feelings finally finding a crack in the surface through which they can send a signal. A signal that says, there is more. There has always been more. And it has been waiting for you to be ready to receive it. The empowerment in this conversation does not come from a sudden decision to become radically transparent with everyone in your life. That is not what emotional authenticity requires, and prescribing it as a solution would be both naive and potentially harmful. The empowerment comes from something more foundational. It comes from the decision to stop lying to yourself first. Because the deepest and most damaging form of emotional suppression is not the feelings you hide from others. It is the feelings you hide from yourself. The story you tell yourself about why you went quiet in that moment. The narrative you construct to explain why the relationship drifted without ever examining your own role in allowing the distance to grow. The reframing of your own hurt as indifference, your own longing as independence, your own grief as acceptance. Self-deception of this kind is not stupidity. It is the mind's most sophisticated defense mechanism. It is the psyche protecting its own coherence by revising the emotional record before it can be fully experienced. James Baldwin, one of the most psychologically penetrating writers of the 20th century, wrote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. That sentence is not about social justice alone. It is about the interior life. It is about the personal archaeology of unspoken truth. The first and most radical act of emotional authenticity is not speaking your truth to another person. It is facing your truth alone. It is sitting in the quiet of your own consciousness and allowing what is actually there to be there, without revision, without reframing, without the immediate impulse to make it more acceptable. What are the feelings you have been most consistently unwilling to face in yourself? Not the feelings you've shared selectively or processed intellectually, but the ones that remain unnamed even in the privacy of your own mind? What is the emotion that sits in the center of your most recurring conflict, the one you circle around endlessly without ever quite landing on? What is the feeling beneath the anger, the boredom, the vague dissatisfaction, that you have never allowed to fully surface? These questions are not comfortable. They are not meant to be. Discomfort in this context is not a warning signal. It is a compass. It is pointing you toward the exact terrain you have been avoiding, which is also, almost always, the terrain where your most important growth is waiting. Here is a subtle but transformative shift in perspective that changes everything. Stop thinking about your unspoken feelings as problems to be resolved and start understanding them as parts of yourself waiting to be integrated. Every feeling you have suppressed, every truth you have swallowed, every version of yourself you have hidden, these are not foreign objects to be removed. They are exiled aspects of your own wholeness, waiting not for correction but for acknowledgement. Carl Rogers, the founder of humanistic psychology, built his entire therapeutic framework on a single profound insight. That the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. Not when I fix myself. Not when I improve myself. When I accept myself. That acceptance begins with the willingness to know what you actually feel. Not the curated version. Not the socially acceptable version. The real, raw, sometimes irrational, sometimes devastating, sometimes inexplicably beautiful truth of your actual inner experience. This is not the same as being controlled by your feelings. Awareness and domination are not the same thing. In fact, the feelings that control you most powerfully are precisely the ones you refuse to acknowledge. The suppressed emotion does not lose its power. It gains it. It operates from below the threshold of your awareness, shaping decisions, distorting perceptions, and writing the narrative of your life without your conscious participation. When you bring a feeling into full awareness, when you face it directly, name it precisely, and allow yourself to genuinely experience it, something remarkable happens. Its power over you does not increase. It transforms. It moves from being a hidden driver of your behavior to being information you can actually use. This is the mindset shift that changes the entire relationship between you and your own emotional life. Feelings are not your enemies. They are not weaknesses. They are not evidence of your inadequacy or your instability. They are the most sophisticated navigation system you possess, and you have been flying with it switched off. We have arrived at the deepest layer. The place beneath the psychology, beneath the neuroscience, beneath the cultural critique. The place where the most important truth of this entire conversation lives quietly, waiting to be seen. Here is that truth. The feelings you have spent your life leaving unspoken are not separate from you. They are not excess emotional material to be processed and discarded. They are the most honest record of your existence that you possess. Every feeling you have ever suppressed was a response to something real. To a real moment, a real person, a real experience of being alive in a world that is often confusing and frequently painful and occasionally so beautiful it becomes almost unbearable. Those feelings are your testimony. They are the evidence that you were genuinely present for your own life, that things moved you, that you were not merely passing through your existence as a neutral observer but were being shaped and marked and transformed by it. To suppress them is not just to harm your psychology. It is to deny your own witness. It is to look at the record of your most authentic responses to being alive and decide again and again that it is not fit for the world's eyes or even your own. The philosopher Martin Heidegger spoke of what he called authentic existence, the rare and demanding choice to live in genuine relationship with your own truth rather than retreating into what he called the they, the anonymous social mass that dictates acceptable feeling and permissible expression. Most human beings, he argued, spend their entire lives in inauthenticity. Not because they are dishonest people, but because authentic existence is genuinely difficult. It requires the courage to be a self in a world that is constantly pressuring you to be a role. And this is where we arrive at the final and most powerful idea this video can offer you. The crisis of unspoken feelings is not, at its root, a communication problem. It is an identity problem. When you consistently suppress your emotional truth, you are not just withholding information from others. You are gradually dismantling your own sense of who you are. Because identity is not constructed from thoughts alone. It is constructed from the full integration of thought, feeling, and expression. When expression is chronically removed from that equation, when the loop between feeling and communication is perpetually broken, the self begins to lose coherence. You begin to feel like a performance of a person rather than a person. You begin to experience what psychologists call depersonalization in its everyday form. The subtle but deeply unsettling sense that you are watching your own life from a slight but permanent distance. This is why so many people, despite external success and social connection, report feeling fundamentally unknown. Not because the people around them are incapable of knowing them, but because they have never offered those people access to the version of themselves that is actually worth knowing. The version beneath the performance. The version that feels things deeply and is sometimes frightened and occasionally overwhelmed and consistently more complex than any social presentation could capture. That version of you, the unperformed, unedited, emotionally honest version, is not your liability. It is your most profound asset. It is the source of your most meaningful connections, your most creative thinking, your most genuine experience of being alive. Every great human connection in history has been built not on impressive performances but on moments of unguarded truth. The conversation that changed a relationship forever was almost never the polished one. It was the one where something real slipped through, where the mask shifted, where one person looked at another and, for a moment, allowed themselves to be completely seen. Those moments are not accidents. They are what human beings are actually hungry for beneath all the noise and performance and careful social navigation. They are what the heart has been asking for, often wordlessly, for your entire life. Now consider what it would mean to stop making those moments accidental. To stop waiting for vulnerability to slip through the cracks of your defenses and instead begin, slowly and with genuine discernment, to choose it. Not performative vulnerability. Not the aestheticized emotional disclosure that social media has turned into its own form of armor. But the quiet, specific, genuine act of saying what is actually true to the people who have genuinely earned the right to hear it. This does not require grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It begins in the smallest possible moments. It begins with noticing what you actually feel before automatically reaching for the acceptable version. It begins with choosing just once to let a real response replace a rehearsed one. It begins with the radical and quietly revolutionary act of treating your own inner life as something worth knowing. There is a quiet revolution happening at the edges of this culture, largely invisible to the systems that benefit from your emotional silence. It is being carried not by movements or institutions but by individual human beings who have decided, one conversation at a time, to stop performing themselves and start inhabiting themselves. These are not people who have eliminated fear or resolved all their psychological complexity. They are people who have made a different decision about what to do with that fear and complexity. They have decided that the cost of continued silence is higher than the risk of genuine expression. They have decided that being truly known by even one person is worth more than being impressively presented to many. They have decided that a life lived at the full depth of their own emotional truth, however uncomfortable, is the only life actually worth having. You are watching this video because something in you already knows this. Something beneath your conditioning, beneath your learned silence, beneath the sophisticated architecture of your emotional self-protection. Something in you has always known that there is more depth available to your life than you have been allowing yourself to access. That knowing is not a small thing. It is the most important intelligence you possess. It is the part of you that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for the rest of you to catch up. The unspoken feelings are not your burden. They are your depth. And depth, once accessed, does not make life heavier. It makes it real. It makes it yours. It makes it, for perhaps the first time, genuinely and completely inhabited. This is the only life you are certain of having. The question is not whether your feelings deserve to exist. They already exist. The question is whether you are willing to finally let them matter. If this conversation reached something in you that most content never touches, leave a comment below with just one word, the feeling you have been carrying longest without speaking its name. No explanation needed, just the word. You will be surprised how seen you feel simply by naming it and how seen others feel reading it. Share this with someone who lives deeply but speaks carefully. They will know exactly why you sent it. And if you are ready to keep descending into the psychology of what makes us most human, most complex, and most alive, this channel will always be here, waiting at exactly the depth you need.